Millionaire CEO stopped at rundown Roadside Café, and instead of a waiter, a little girl served him. By the time he learned the truth, he wasn't just a customer. He was part of something far more fragile and far more beautiful. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Your comments make this community feel like home. Elijah Cross hadn't planned to stop. In fact, he hadn't planned to be anywhere near this stretch of cracked road ever again. It was the same back road that wound through the dying edge of Pine Hollow, the small town he had peeled himself away from when he was barely 18 and never looked back. The cornfields still whispered in the wind like they had when he was a teenager, sneaking out at night pretending that the sky was just a ceiling he could punch through if he ran fast enough. Back then, his world had felt too small, like a jar with the lid screwed on tight. He had promised himself he would never return, not even if the past came knocking. But here he was almost 22 years later, at 39 years old, sitting behind the wheel of his luxury car, with one hand clenched too tightly around the steering wheel, and the other holding an envelope that might as well have been a ghost. The plan had been simple. Sign the final sale documents on his late mother's dilapidated property, shake hands with a tired real estate lawyer, and drive away with one more piece of his past buried for good. But somewhere between the highway and the gravel road that led into town, something inside him had shifted. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the familiar way the wind moved through the trees. Maybe it was just exhaustion. He hadn't slept properly in weeks. Not since he'd started dreaming of a little girl's voice he couldn't place saying his name like it meant something. He hadn't told his assistant where he was going. She thought he was taking a mental health day. The truth was, Elijah wasn't sure what kind of day this was. All he knew was that he'd driven nearly 4 hours without checking a single email, and now, somewhere between guilt and confusion, hunger had started to gnaw at him. That was when he saw it. A small roadside cafe tucked between an empty gas station and an old laundromat with a missing sign. The cafe's paint had once been red, but now it flaked off in tired strips, revealing the wood beneath. A crooked sign above the door read, "June's Place," in faded white letters, and one side of it hung by a rusted chain swaying gently in the wind. Elijah almost kept driving. Almost. His foot hovered over the gas pedal, his mind urging him forward toward the safety of closure and contracts. But something about the name, June's Place. It tugged at something buried deep in his chest. A name he hadn't said aloud in years. His mother's name, without quite realizing why, he turned the wheel and pulled into the empty gravel lot. The engine purred into silence, and for a moment he just sat there, watching the windows fog slightly from the inside. There were no cars in the lot, no sounds of clinking dishes or laughter. Just stillness, a kind of paused breath. He stepped out of the car, adjusting the collar of his coat. The wind cut through the air sharp and cold, carrying with it the scent of earth, and something sweeter. Cinnamon, maybe, or warm butter. His shoes crunched softly on the gravel as he approached the front door, which stuck slightly when he pulled it open. Inside the cafe felt like a different world. It was small, warm, with mismatched chairs and a counter lined with old glass jars filled with sugar packets and faded lollipops. The walls were decorated with drawings, some done by a child's hand, others more careful, more deliberate. A chalkboard menu stood propped behind the counter, its writing smudged in places but still readable. Pancakes, coffee, soup of the day, apple pie. The scent was stronger here, comforting and nostalgic. There was no music, no television, just the soft hum of something simmering in the back and the tick of an old wall clock. He was halfway to sitting down when she appeared. She couldn't have been older than 6. Long brown hair fell in soft waves down her back, pulled into a loose ponytail with a red ribbon that looked like it had been tied too many times. She wore a red apron that swallowed her small frame, tied awkwardly at her waist, over a plain white shirt and jeans with one knee patched in floral fabric. In one hand she held a notepad, in the other a pen with a fuzzy purple pom-pom on the end. Her eyes were steady and brown, her voice surprisingly clear. "Would you like a table, sir?" Elijah blinked. He stared at her, unsure whether he had stepped into some kind of dream. He looked around again, expecting a parent to appear from behind the counter or a hidden door. No one did. He cleared his throat. "Is your mom or dad here?" "My mom's in the kitchen," the girl answered simply. "We don't have a lot of help. I take orders and she cooks. It's just us, most days." Her tone was matter-of-fact. Not resentful, just normal. Like a child saying she fed the dog or folded napkins. He studied her face. There was something about her. The shape of her chin, the arch of her brows, a faint curve of the mouth that felt too familiar. He couldn't place it, and that unsettled him. "You can sit anywhere," she said, gesturing grandly toward the room like a tiny hostess. The table by the window's the warmest. He nodded, more out of habit than clarity, and walked toward the table she'd pointed to. She followed, pulled out a chair for him with great effort, and stood patiently waiting to take his order, I guess. "Coffee for now," he said, slowly. "And whatever's warm." The girl nodded, scribbled something on her notepad with exaggerated seriousness, and turned to leave. As she did, he noticed the bracelet on her wrist. A thin, worn leather band too big for her small wrist, but cinched tightly with a knot. On the outside, it looked unremarkable. But when she turned her arm slightly to steady the tray, she grabbed from the counter. The inside of the bracelet caught the light. There, faint but unmistakable, was a carved name. Ray. Elijah's breath caught. His heart stuttered. Ray. It had been a silly nickname carved with a pocket knife into a strip of leather one summer when he was 15 and his older sister was 17. Rachel, his only family. The one he hadn't spoken to since before his mother's funeral. The one he left behind with an aunt who drank too much and promised too little. The sister he had loved like a twin. Ray. The bracelet. It couldn't be. It had been lost, thrown into a box or buried under years. And now here it was. On the wrist of a 6-year-old girl bringing him coffee, sir. He looked up. The girl was standing beside him again, balancing a chipped ceramic mug on the tray and setting it down with slow precision. A small plate followed with a slice of pie still steaming. "My mom says this one turned out good today. Thank you," he said. His voice slightly hoarse. She nodded and turned to go again, but he stopped her. "What's your name?" She paused, turned halfway back and smiled. "June." He stared at her. The world tilted. The air changed. "That's a pretty name," he said quietly. "Was it your mom's idea?" June nodded. "She says it was my grandma's name too. But she never met her. She died before I was born." He nodded slowly, like the world had just dropped a stone into his chest. June. The name of their mother. Of course it was. "Of course," she was named. "That could I speak to your mom, June?" "Just for a moment." She tilted her head. "You're not mad about the pie, are you?" "I didn't bake it, I swear." He smiled, surprised. "No. The pie is perfect." "Okay," she said, skipping lightly toward the swinging door at the back of the cafe. He heard her voice float back toward him. "Mommy, a man wants to talk to you. He's not mad about the pie." Elijah's hands trembled slightly. He reached for the coffee mug to anchor himself, took a slow sip, and waited. The ticking of the clock was louder now. His heart thudded against his ribs like it was trying to warn him. Then the door swung open again and she stepped out. Rachel Cross looked almost exactly like she had the last time he saw her, and yet entirely different. Her hair was darker now, pulled up in a messy bun. A smudge of flour marked one cheek. She wore a faded apron over a gray sweater and a towel hung over her shoulder. But it was her eyes that froze him in place. Eyes so familiar, so full of disbelief. "Elijah." Her voice cracked on the name like it was something sharp. He stood slowly, his legs stiff, his heart unsure of what came next. He opened his mouth, but no words came. She took one step forward, then stopped, her arms folded across her chest. Not angry, just bracing. "What are you doing here?" I didn't know," he said quietly. "I just stopped. I didn't know this was yours." She shook her head once. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not with malice, but with the kind of pain that settles when old wounds reopen. "You never answered. I wrote you." Did you know that he blinked? What I wrote you when I found out I was pregnant. Sent it to the address Mom had. Aunt Lisa said you moved. That you didn't want anything to do with us. I never got it. He said, his voice low. I didn't know Rachel didn't respond right away. She looked toward the kitchen where June had disappeared, then back at him. That's your niece Elijah. Her name is June. I named her after Mom. She's 6. She already knows how to take care of customers better than half the adults I've met. His throat felt like sandpaper. He sat back down hard, unable to process all of it at once. The bracelet. The name. Her face. I didn't know. He said again, I swear to God, Ray. I didn't know. She didn't answer. Not with words. Just a long look. Somewhere between heartbreak and something too old to name. And outside, the wind rustled through the cornfields again, like a whisper of the past, asking if this time he might finally stay. Rachel didn't sit. She stood there with her arms crossed, her fingers tucked under her elbows, like they had been trained over the years to hold more than just warmth. They held silence, history, and the kind of weariness that comes from doing everything yourself for far too long. Elijah could barely look at her without feeling like the walls of the cafe were closing in around him. The scent of pie and cinnamon had faded beneath the weight of the moment, replaced by something colder. The air between them wasn't angry, not yet, but it was sharp and waiting. Rachel finally let out a breath and moved toward the counter. She poured herself a coffee from the glass pot and set it down in front of her without offering him one. She didn't need to. He already had a mug in front of him that had gone cold, while he waited for the pass to hit him in the chest. She leaned against the counter, then not relaxed but settled like a tree, still braced against a storm long after the wind has passed. So you just stopped in? She said, her voice flat. No idea where you were. No idea this place even existed. I swear I didn't know, Elijah said. I wasn't looking for you. I wasn't looking for anything. I just left the office and drove. The road brought me here. The road, she repeated, almost like the word offended her. Not me. Not the cafe. Not your niece. Just the road. I didn't know she was mine, he said softly, trying to catch her gaze. I didn't even know you had a daughter. You didn't know because you didn't ask. Rachel snapped, then quickly checked herself. Her voice dropped again, steadier but tired. You disappeared. No calls, no letters, no return address. I was pregnant and terrified, and the one person who should have understood what it was like to be alone in this world had vanished. I didn't vanish, he said too quickly. I was pushed out. You remember what it was like with Aunt Lisa? I had to get out. I was barely holding on myself. And I stayed. Rachel said, her voice bitter now. I stayed because someone had to. Someone had to be the adult when the adults failed. You think I wanted to stay in that house with that woman? I stayed. Because if I didn't, June would have been born into nothing. She would have had no one. You left and got rich. I stayed and got tired. He looked down at his hands knotted together on the tabletop. His knuckles were white. The silence between them stretched, not cruelly, but densely like a rope pulled tight. Outside, a car passed slowly on the road, the sound of tires crunching gravel echoing for a moment before fading again. Rachel sighed and took a long sip from her coffee, her fingers wrapped tight around the mug like it was the only thing grounding her. Elijah tried again. I didn't get rich right away. I struggled too. I slept in my car the first winter after I left. I worked 2 jobs while finishing school. I built what I have because I told myself I'd never need anyone again. Well, congratulations, Rachel said. You got your wish. You didn't need anyone, and you made sure no one needed you either. That's not fair, he said, his voice catching. I didn't know. I swear, Rachel, I didn't get your letter. I never even knew you had a daughter. If I had known... What, she asked, finally looking at him fully. If you had known, what would you have done? Dropped everything and come back, taken responsibility for something you didn't even understand? Or would you have sent money and called it love? I would have come back, he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice now. I would have come back and stayed. I wouldn't have let you do this alone. Rachel didn't say anything to that. Her jaw tightened, but her eyes dropped slightly like a flicker of doubt had cracked through her certainty. She didn't want to believe him. It would be easier not to. But part of her had always wondered what would have happened if Elijah had walked through that door one day exactly like he just had. Maybe she had imagined this moment too many times for it to feel real now. Maybe that was why it hurt so much. You missed 6 years, Elijah, she said finally, her voice quieter. 6 birthdays. 6 winters. 6 times she got sick and I had to sit up all night holding her hand while trying not to fall apart. You missed her first steps, her first day of school, the first time she got scared of thunder and crawled into my bed. You missed all of it. I know, he whispered. And I'll never get that back. But I'm here now. If there's anything left I can be part of, I want to be. Rachel didn't reply. She turned away and walked behind the counter again, busying herself with stacking napkins that didn't need stacking. Elijah watched her hands, small and quick, still the same as he remembered. She had always been the steady one. Even when their parents were gone, even when Aunt Lisa forgot to buy groceries for days, Rachel had kept things running. He had run from that weight. She had carried it. The door to the kitchen swung open again, and June emerged with a crayon in one hand and a half-colored piece of paper in the other. She paused when she saw them both, and then walked straight to Elijah's table. "Do you like flowers?" she asked him. Holding out the drawing, he took it with gentle fingers. "I do. They're for you," she said. "Because you look sad." He smiled, though his throat ached. "Thank you, June. That's very kind." She climbed onto the bench across from him without asking, her legs swinging off the side. She picked up his spoon and tapped it against her knee thoughtfully. "Mommy says you knew my grandma?" she said. After a pause, he nodded. "Yes. She was my mom, too." "That makes us family," June said like it was the simplest equation in the world. Rachel watched from behind the counter, unmoving. Her hands had stopped stacking napkins. Her eyes didn't leave the two of them. "You want to draw with me?" June asked. "I got new crayons from the lady next door. She says purple is the color of dreams." Elijah swallowed hard and nodded. "Sure." I'd like that. June jumped down and took his hand without hesitation, leading him toward a small corner of the cafe, where a tiny table was set up with coloring books, crayons, and a worn teddy bear missing one ear. She handed him a blank sheet of paper and chose a purple crayon for him, then plopped down with all the authority of a seasoned artist. "Draw something you miss," she said, and started sketching a big sun with rays that looked like spaghetti noodles. Elijah sat unsure of how to hold the crayon, unsure of what to draw. But then his hand started to move, slowly, awkwardly. A window, a tree, a small house, a face. Rachel's face. The way she looked when they were kids sitting on the roof with peanut butter sandwiches and no plans. He didn't notice Rachel walking over until she was standing behind him. She looked down at the drawing, then at him. Her voice was softer now. "You're not good at staying inside the lines." "I never was," he said quietly. June looked up at them both. "Mommy, can Uncle Elijah stay for dinner?" Rachel blinked. The word hung in the air like a bell still ringing. Uncle Elijah. Dinner. All strung together like they'd always belonged. "I don't know, sweetie," Rachel said carefully. "He might have somewhere to be." Elijah looked at her. "No. I don't." Rachel held his gaze, then slowly nodded. "All right. But you're helping peel carrots." "I've done worse," he said, and June laughed like it was the funniest thing she'd ever heard. That night he stayed. He peeled carrots badly. He set the table wrong. He dropped a spoon and almost set off the smoke alarm trying to stir the stew when Rachel wasn't looking. But June never stopped smiling, and Rachel never asked him to leave. After dinner, they sat in the small living room behind the cafe. June fell asleep with her head on Elijah's lap while he read a picture book, stumbling over the voices, but never once stopping. Rachel folded laundry nearby, her hands moving quietly as she watched them. "You're good with her," she said after a while. "I don't know what I'm doing." he admitted. No one does, she said. But she likes you. That counts for something. He looked down at June's sleeping face. Her lashes fluttered as she dreamed. Her hand curled slightly around his thumb. I want to come back, he said. Not just tonight. I want to know her. And you. If you'll let me. Rachel didn't answer right away, but when she did, her voice was steady. Then come back. Don't promise it. Just do it. I've had enough promises. I will, he said. I promise. She raised an eyebrow and he caught his mistake. I mean, I will. That's all. That's better, she said. And somehow it was. Elijah returned 3 days later. He didn't call ahead. He didn't send a text or an email. He simply got in his car again. Turned off the highway earlier this time and let the familiar roads lead him back to the little cafe with the crooked sign and the peeling red paint. The same wind stirred through the cornfields. The same gravel crunched beneath his tires, but something in him felt different. Last time he had walked in as a man haunted by his past. This time he walked in like someone hoping to belong. June saw him first. Through the foggy glass of the front window, she pressed her face to the pane, her breath making tiny clouds as she shouted something muffled he could not hear. The door swung open a moment later, and she came running in socks that barely gripped the floor, her red apron already covered in flour. You came back, she beamed, cheeks flushed with delight. I told Mommy you would. Elijah crouched to meet her at eye level. I said I would. Didn't I? She nodded solemnly, like she was confirming a truth older than both of them. Then she grabbed his hand with complete trust and pulled him inside. Come on, we're making cookies today. The good kind, the ones with the squiggle chocolate. He followed, laughing in spite of himself, his coat still draped over one arm, his scarf half undone. The cafe smelled of sugar and warm vanilla. The radio played softly in the background, an old song he didn't recognize but felt like he should. Everything inside the cafe felt lived in. Safe, like it had wrapped itself around a family and refused to let go. Rachel stood behind the counter, her hair pulled up into a loose bun again. Her sleeves rolled to her elbows as she wiped her hands on a towel. When she looked up and saw him, her expression didn't change right away. But there was no tension in her shoulders, no visible bracing, just a quiet acknowledgement, a flicker of something that might have been relief. You're early, she said. You need help, don't you? He replied with a crooked grin. She tossed the towel over her shoulder and nodded. Come on then. We'll see if those hands of yours are good for anything besides contracts and press releases. That morning, Elijah learned that sifting flour was not as easy as it looked. He learned that chocolate chips did not go into the batter until June said so, and that stirring clockwise made the dough better according to her. He burned the edge of his thumb on the oven door and dropped a tray of utensils that scattered across the tile floor. Rachel rolled her eyes but did not scold him. June laughed so hard she nearly dropped the bowl she was holding. Elijah found himself laughing too. Real laughter. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and long forgotten. Customers trickled in slowly. Regulars judging by how they greeted Rachel by name and how easily June brought menus to their tables without being asked. Elijah stayed mostly in the back, wiping down counters and helping Rachel refill sugar jars and stack dishes. No one asked who he was. A few glanced at him curiously, and one older woman said to June, "Is that your daddy, honey?" June giggled. "No, that's my Uncle Elijah. He's new, but he's learning." The woman smiled warmly. "Well, he looks like he belongs." Elijah's hands stilled for a moment over a stack of clean plates. Those words settled into him like a drop of warm syrup. He looks like he belongs. He hadn't felt that in years. Around noon, when the last of the lunch customers had left and the kitchen quieted, they sat in the corner booth with 3 mismatched mugs and a plate of the best cookies Elijah had ever tasted. June had frosting on her nose and her feet curled beneath her as she munched happily. Rachel sat across from Elijah, sipping tea and watching her daughter with a softness in her eyes that had nothing to do with the drink. "She likes you," Rachel said suddenly. Elijah nodded. "I like her too. She doesn't warm up to people quickly. Most adults think she's too serious, or too curious, or too much. But you..." She looked at him as if trying to find the words. You let her be. Maybe because I see a little of myself in her, he said quietly. She's got your eyes, Rachel admitted. And your stubbornness, I wondered, Elijah said. I didn't want to assume she's not mine biologically, Rachel said flatly. And for a moment the air stilled. Elijah blinked. What I adopted her when she was just under a year old. Her birth mother was a friend of mine. Not a close one, but someone who needed help. She was going to leave her at a shelter. I couldn't let that happen. Elijah couldn't find the words. Rachel nodded. I didn't tell you because I didn't think it mattered. And maybe because I knew if you ever did show up, I wanted you to love her for her. Not out of guilt. Not out of biology, I do, he said. Immediately, I do love her. Rachel's gaze softened. I know. He looked over at June, who was carefully pressing 2 cookies together to make a sandwich. He felt his chest ache with the weight of it. This girl, this bright, kind child. She wasn't a blood relative, and yet she had his bracelet. She had his mother's name. She had already wrapped herself around the loose threads of his heart and pulled. Why the bracelet, he asked after a moment. Rachel looked down at her mug and traced the rim with one finger. I found it in a box after Mom died. I almost threw it out. But then I thought, maybe one day it would mean something again. Elijah nodded slowly. It does. It means everything. June glanced up at that moment and grinned at them both. Want to see my fort? They followed her to the back of the cafe where she had set up a small arrangement of chairs and blankets between 2 bookshelves. Inside were pillows and a flashlight and a stack of storybooks. Elijah ducked his head and crawled in after her. Rachel stood at the edge of the doorway, watching with her arms crossed but her expression unguarded. You're going to have a hard time getting up from that position, she teased. Worth it. He called back and June giggled beside him. Later, after the fort had been dismantled and the cafe closed for the day, they sat in the tiny apartment upstairs that Rachel had carved out of 2 old storage rooms and a disused office. The furniture was mismatched. The floor creaked. The windows fogged easily. But it was warm. It was home. Elijah sat at the small kitchen table with June on his lap as she showed him a drawing she had made of the 3 of them standing in front of the cafe, with the words, "My family," scrawled above in uneven letters. Rachel watched from the sink where she was rinsing the last of the dishes. That's me in the middle, June said proudly, and that's you with the big shoes, and that's Mommy with the ponytail. You gave me a tie, Elijah said, amused. You look like someone who wears ties fair. And this? Rachel asked gently, pointing to a shape in the background. That's our dog, June said matter-of-factly. We don't have a dog, Rachel reminded her. Yet, June said with a wink. Elijah laughed and June beamed as if she had won a prize. After bedtime, when June had finally been tucked in with a bear nearly as large as she was, and a nightlight humming softly in the corner, Elijah stood by the doorway, unsure whether to stay or leave. Rachel sat on the small couch with a blanket pulled over her knees and her hair down for the first time since he had arrived. She doesn't remember her birth mother, he said quietly. Rachel shook her head. No, I don't think she ever will. But I've told her the truth, that she was loved, that she was chosen, that she is wanted. That's the most important part. Rachel looked up at him. Her father never stepped forward, never asked, never called. I raised her alone because no one else did. You shouldn't have had to, but I did, and I'd do it again. Every minute of it. I'm not here to rewrite history, Elijah said. I can't. But I want to be part of whatever comes next. Rachel didn't answer right away. She looked at the window where the night had drawn its curtain and the stars blinked faintly through the fogged glass. She adores you, she said. If you leave, I won't. If your world calls you back and you decide this is too small, too quiet, too slow, it won't. Rachel studied him, her eyes searching for cracks. All right, she said softly. Then show me. Don't say it. Just show me. He nodded. His voice was steady. I will. And that night, as he drove back to the rental cabin he had taken near the edge of town with the drawing tucked safely in his coat pocket and the ghost of laughter still echoing in his ears, Elijah Cross finally understood something he had never grasped in all his years of success and solitude. Family was not built in blood or names or perfect timing. It was built in crayon drawings, in burned cookies, in pillow forts and quiet promises. And he would come back again and again, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The days that followed settled into a rhythm none of them expected, but all three of them welcomed. Elijah began showing up at the cafe more often than he had intended. Sometimes in the early morning before the sun had even touched the frost on the windows, and sometimes in the afternoon just before the rush of regulars needing soup or something warm to carry them through the cold. He never announced himself. He never made promises about when he would come next. But he came. Always. Without asking permission and without explanation, as if the cafe itself had quietly become part of his body's muscle memory, Rachel didn't ask questions. She didn't try to define what his presence meant. She simply handed him an apron when he appeared and pointed him toward whatever task needed doing. At first it was small things, carrying in milk crates from the supply truck, sweeping the front stoop, fixing the wobbly stool near the window that had annoyed her for months. Then it became more involved, stirring soups, folding napkins, memorizing who liked honey in their tea and who preferred to sit facing the door. He blended in slowly like warm water into bread dough. Not obvious, not flashy, just steady, the customers noticed. Some more than others. A retired schoolteacher named Helen commented that it was good to see a strong back behind the counter again. A teenage boy who came every Thursday for the free refill policy raised an eyebrow and asked if Elijah was Rachel's brother. When June answered, she said no with a giggle. "He's my uncle, but also kind of like my best friend." That made Elijah smile for the rest of the day. He started keeping things at the cafe, a pair of gloves in the drawer behind the register, an old hoodie on the coat rack near the back. He didn't think about it as a decision. It just happened like water finding its way through the cracks. Rachel noticed, but said nothing. June noticed too and made sure he had a corner of the art wall where she pinned drawings of the three of them. Sometimes stick figures with giant heads and triangle bodies. Sometimes hearts and sunbursts with names inside them. Always she labeled it, "My Family," in uneven block letters. One morning, as the first snow of winter dusted the edge of town, Elijah arrived with a toolbox and a small wooden bench he had bought at a second-hand store. The bench was simple, sturdy, and painted soft green. He placed it outside the front door, brushed the snow off the edges, and tightened the legs with a quiet satisfaction. Rachel watched him through the window and said nothing. But later that afternoon, when the snow began falling harder and the cafe felt like a shelter wrapped in cinnamon and warmth, she brought him a slice of pie without asking and said softly, "You made it look like it was always there." That night he stayed to help close. June fell asleep in the corner booth, halfway through a story she insisted Elijah read 3 times. Rachel carried her upstairs and came back down with a blanket draped over her shoulders. Elijah was wiping down the chalkboard menu, the words slightly smudged from too many hands and too much steam. "She trusts you," Rachel said from the doorway. "I hope so," Elijah replied without turning. "She does. I've never seen her take to someone so quickly. Not even me, if I'm being honest. It took months before she called me Mom. With you, it was like she already knew Elijah set the chalk down and turned to face her. The light from the hanging lamp above the counter cast soft shadows on the worn tile floor. I feel like I know her too. Like she's been part of something I lost and didn't know I could find again." Rachel stepped closer. Her arms were still wrapped tightly around her, but her voice was quieter now. "I want to believe that. I do. But I've learned that believing comes with cost. Every time I start to trust that someone will stay, the world has a way of pulling the rug out. I'm not the world Elijah said. I'm just a man who left once and wishes he hadn't, and I'm just a woman who stayed and learned to live with silence. I'm not silent anymore. No, you're not. But words are easy. Showing up is harder." He nodded. Then I'll keep showing up. The next morning, Elijah returned again. This time he brought blueprints, or at least a crude version of them folded and tucked under his arm like a treasure. June was seated at the coloring table working on a picture of a treehouse with a spiral slide when he arrived. She spotted the paper and immediately asked if it was a treasure map. Sort of, he said, unfolding it at one of the back tables. It's a plan for something new. She crawled onto the bench beside him, her eyes wide and eager. What is it? A treehouse, he said, for someone who dreams in purple and draws with her tongue sticking out. She grinned so wide her face could barely hold it. Is it for me? Only if you help build it. Rachel came over, then drying her hands on her apron. What's this? Elijah turned the paper toward her. A treehouse. Out back. By the edge of the property. There's a good spot with strong trees and space for a platform. You want to build her a treehouse, I want to build us something. Something that lasts. Rachel looked at him for a long moment, then at the paper, then at her daughter, who had already begun adding crayon flowers to the margin of the blueprint. You know how to build one, not even a little. But I know how to ask for help. And I've already spoken to a guy in town who used to do carpentry. He said he'd come by this weekend, and just like that it began. A new rhythm. Mornings at the cafe, afternoons gathering wood, evenings measuring and arguing over whether a ladder or rope swing made more sense. June weighed in on every decision. Rachel eventually gave in and made hot cocoa in a thermos that Elijah claimed was too cute for someone with power tools. She rolled her eyes but poured it anyway. They worked through snow, through mud, through a day when the wind nearly took the tarp off the half-built platform. But they didn't stop. And when the final board was nailed into place, and the ladder secured, and the flag with June's handprint painted in the middle fluttered in the breeze, they stood back and looked at what they had made together. It was crooked in places. The slide stuck slightly. But it was perfect. On the day they finished, June insisted on a picnic inside. Elijah carried the sandwiches. Rachel brought the lemonade. They sat on small cushions in the corner, while June told them the rules of the treehouse. Rule 1, only kind people allowed. Rule 2, no yelling unless it's about how much you love someone. Rule 3, always say thank you. Rachel raised an eyebrow at that third one. Where did that come from? June shrugged. Probably from him, she pointed at Elijah. He says thank you for everything, even when I give him the broken cookies. That night, as the cafe lights dimmed and the last customers drifted home with warm pies in paper boxes, Elijah stood at the counter with a stack of receipts and a pencil behind his ear. Rachel leaned beside him, her arms crossed as she watched him do the math on napkins. You ever think about what you'd be doing if you hadn't stopped here that day? She asked. All the time, he said. And every time I do, I get this sinking feeling like I almost missed the most important thing in my life. Rachel studied him for a moment. Her voice was cautious. And what happens when your other life calls you back? The board meetings, the investors, the city. Then I make them wait. And if they don't wait, then I leave them behind. I've done that before. She looked at him for a long moment and then said nothing more. But later, when June was asleep and the cafe was silent, she came down the stairs, holding something in her hands. It was the letter, the one she had written to him over 6 years ago, the one he never received. I want you to read this, she said. Not because I want you to feel bad, but because I want you to understand what I went through. Elijah took the envelope with careful fingers and opened it slowly. The paper was soft from age, the ink slightly smudged, but the words were clear. It spoke of fear, of confusion, of the weight of being alone with a child not yet born and no one left to call. It spoke of a brother she loved, but could not reach. It ended with a sentence that stayed in his chest for the rest of the night. I don't know if you'll ever see this, but if you do, I hope you remember who we were before the silence. When he looked up, Rachel was watching him, and for the first time since his return, her eyes weren't guarded. They were just tired. I would have come back, he said again. I would have crawled if I had to. I believe you now. Then let me stay. She nodded slowly. Then stay. The snow melted slowly that year. March came in with gray skies and slushy streets. But the cafe stayed warm. Elijah had never spent so much time in one place without needing to check a stock report or update a board slide. His phone still buzzed now and then with calls from cities that felt a world away. He answered some of them. Most he ignored. When he did take a call, he walked to the edge of the property behind the cafe and stood near the trees, always glancing back toward the windows, making sure June didn't see the tiredness in his eyes. June had begun introducing him as her favorite person in the world. Sometimes she whispered it when she thought he wasn't listening. Sometimes she said it boldly in front of customers as if daring them to challenge her claim. Elijah never corrected her. Not once. And Rachel, while quiet about the growing closeness between them, started setting out a fourth plate at dinner without thinking and making enough tea for 2 mugs instead of 1. It was as if they were all drifting toward something unspoken but undeniably real. One evening, just after closing, Rachel sat at the cafe counter going over receipts while Elijah swept the floor. June had already gone upstairs, her legs heavy with sleep, her bear tucked under one arm. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and the last of the snow melted into puddles on the sidewalk. "I've been thinking," Rachel said, not looking up from the paper. Elijah paused the broom for a moment. "Just one thing," she smiled faintly. "Maybe 2. Go on." "You never really told me what made you stop here that first day." Elijah leaned on the broom handle and took a slow breath. "It was instinct, I guess. I'd just driven away from a meeting that went sideways. Some acquisition mess with too many lawyers and too little common sense. I was angry. Not at the deal, really. Just everything. Myself, mostly. And you took a wrong turn. Maybe. Or maybe I took the right one for the first time in years." Rachel looked up, then her eyes meeting his across the quiet space. "What made you come back the second time?" "The sandwich," he said with a smile. "The sandwich. You made something small feel sacred. That doesn't happen in my world. People talk about authenticity like it's a brand strategy. Here it just lives in the walls." Rachel folded the receipt in half and set it aside. "The walls are old and drafty. Maybe that's why the truth slips in so easily." They stood there in silence for a long moment, the kind of silence that didn't need filling, the kind that felt like understanding. Then, as if summoned by some unseen cue, the door chimed. They both turned. The lock had been flipped, the lights dimmed, but still, the door creaked open. A man in a dark coat stepped inside. He was tall, thin, with a trimmed beard and eyes that scanned the room like a ledger. He moved like someone used to getting answers fast. "Can I help you?" Rachel asked, her voice steady but alert. "I'm looking for Elijah Cross," the man said, and his gaze landed squarely on Elijah, who hadn't moved. Elijah's posture straightened. "What do you want?" The man stepped closer. "Name's Robert Feldman. I represent your board." Elijah's jaw tightened. "They sent someone here. You've been off the grid too long. They're getting nervous. Investors don't like it when a CEO vanishes into the countryside." "I didn't vanish. I took a leave." "You didn't file a formal notice. I don't owe them a timetable on my healing." Rachel watched the exchange carefully. She didn't say a word. Feldman's voice softened just a fraction. "We're not the enemy, Elijah. But this cafe, this place, it's not your world. You built something global. That comes with responsibility." "And what about my soul?" Elijah asked. "Does that come with a filing cabinet too?" Feldman sighed. "There's a vote scheduled next week. They're discussing succession. If you're not back by Friday, someone else takes your seat permanently." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "Let them. That's a billion-dollar decision. Then they better have good pens." Feldman hesitated, then turned to leave. But before he stepped outside, he looked at Rachel for the first time and said quietly, "I hope you know what he's giving up." She met his eyes without blinking. "I do, and I hope you know what he's gaining." After the door shut, the cafe felt heavy. Elijah turned away slowly, his shoulders rigid. his face unreadable. "I should have told you this would happen," he said. Rachel approached him. Her voice was gentle but firm. "You don't owe me an explanation, but you owe yourself a choice. I made my choice. Have you? Or are you still running?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said quietly, "I used to think success was about legacy, buildings, foundations, headlines. Now I think maybe it's about bedtime stories and remembering to cut the crust off the sandwiches." Rachel smiled faintly. "Then stay for the stories. Let the boardroom find another ghost to worship." Later that night, Elijah stood in the doorway of June's room. She was fast asleep, her mouth slightly open, her tiny hand resting on the sketchbook she had filled with pictures of their treehouse and stars and the three of them holding hands. He didn't dare touch her. He just stood there, letting the warmth of the small room wrap around him like a memory he didn't want to lose. But the next morning when he came downstairs, Rachel was already waiting at the counter with a small brown envelope. "What's this?" he asked. "It's yours. It's your name on the cafe license." Elijah blinked. "You never took my name off. I never had a reason to." Until now, he stared at the envelope, then at her. "You want me to leave?" "No, I want you to stay. But this time I want you to choose it, not because it's easy, not because it's sweet, but because you're willing to let the other life go. And if I'm not ready, then go and decide. But don't come back halfway." He nodded slowly. "Then I need 1 week." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Once. No promises, no calls. Come back whole or not at all." He packed that afternoon. June helped, even though she didn't quite understand what was happening. She folded his shirts wrong and put cookies in the side pocket of his suitcase. When she asked when he'd be back, he kissed her forehead and said soon in a voice that tried not to break. Rachel walked him to the door. No hug, no kiss, just a long look between them. And then he was gone. The cafe felt different without him. The bench outside stayed, but it seemed to lean a little more to one side. The customers asked fewer questions. June asked more. Every night she drew a new picture of him. Every morning she looked at the treehouse with hope that someone would wave from the top. Meanwhile, Elijah returned to the city, to the noise, to the polished hallways and glass elevators and voices that never stopped echoing numbers and risks and growth targets. He walked into the boardroom with a calm face and fire in his chest. "You want someone else in the chair," he said to the room. "Then take it. But I'm not coming back to build more ladders to nowhere." They stared at him in shock. One man began to speak. Elijah held up his hand. "I am not retiring. I am not vanishing. But I am changing the terms. My name stays on the door. My shares remain. But I am putting people in place who know how to build quietly, who value small things. If that makes me a relic, so be it." And then he walked out. He didn't stay in the penthouse. He didn't host a press conference. He left a note with his assistant and drove back toward the road he had once taken by accident. This time, it was not a detour. It was home. When he pulled up to the cafe, it was dusk. The lights were on. The sign outside glowed faintly. He parked, stepped out into the cool air, and took a breath. June saw him first. She was sitting on the bench, a sketchbook in her lap. Her eyes widened and then she ran. Rachel followed seconds later, breath caught in her throat, not daring to believe it. He dropped to one knee as June threw her arms around him. "I told you I'd come back. You said soon. This is late. I had to make sure the world wouldn't follow me this time." Rachel reached them slowly. Her eyes shimmered, but her voice was steady. "You came back. I never left in my heart." She nodded, and this time she didn't hold back. She stepped into his arms and kissed him. Elijah returned not with fanfare or speeches, but with a quiet knock on the back door of the cafe one early morning just before sunrise. The kitchen still smelled of cinnamon and soap from the night before, and Rachel was already up, hands deep in flour, prepping the first batch of morning scones. She looked up when she heard the knock. She didn't say anything for a long moment, just wiped her hands on her apron, walked slowly to the door, and opened it. He was standing there with snow in his hair, a duffel bag at his feet, and a small tin box in his hands. Without a word, he held it out to her. Rachel opened the lid slowly. Inside was the cafe license, but this time her name was the only one on it. Tucked beneath was a photograph she had never seen before. It was the three of them, Elijah, June, and Rachel, taken from behind while they built the treehouse. Sunlight caught their silhouettes and turned them into gold. The corners of the photo were worn, as if he had kept it with him. Rachel looked up at him. "You sure?" Elijah nodded. "I need to be here. Not just want to, need." Rachel didn't smile, but her eyes did. "Then, go set the tables. The early crowd's going to want the good seat by the heater." From that day on, Elijah wasn't a visitor anymore. He was part of the walls, the heartbeat of the place. He took over the early deliveries and fixed a leak in the ceiling that had been dripping for months. He repaired a jammed oven door that Rachel had long given up on and reorganized the pantry in a way that somehow made sense to everyone. He even started keeping his books there. Not corporate reports or manuals, but actual books. Hardcovers with cracked spines and poetry scribbled in the margins. Rachel caught him one morning reading aloud to June while she colored on the floor. He had a voice made for storytelling, calm and rich like old honey, and June sat still, utterly still, her chin propped on her fists. The cafe began to change. Not in big ways, but in how people lingered longer. How customers began asking if Elijah was around before they ordered. How locals brought in photographs and newspaper clippings to add to the art wall June had started. One morning, a couple who had their first date there 15 years earlier brought their teenage son and asked Elijah if he would take their picture. He did, and later framed it, placing it beside the register with a handwritten label that simply said, "Beginnings." Rachel watched all of it unfold and found herself exhaling more often, smiling more easily, sleeping a little deeper at night. She still woke up at times expecting to hear silence, expecting to find Elijah gone, as if this happiness was too fragile to be real. But every time she did, she would hear his low voice in the kitchen, or his boots by the door, or June whispering giggles as he told her another bedtime riddle. And it was real. It stayed real. One afternoon in early spring, a letter arrived. It was addressed to Elijah but sent to the cafe. Rachel handed it to him while wiping her hands on a towel. "What's this?" Elijah studied the envelope. There was no return address, just his name written in careful cursive. He opened it slowly. Inside was a short message typed on heavy paper. It read simply, "I hear you stepped down. I hear you're hiding in a kitchen. If that's true, I hope you're finally happy." Below was a signature he recognized immediately. Abigail Winters, his former partner, the woman he had once considered his fiercest rival, the one who had tried to buy him out twice. He stared at the note for a long time. Rachel poured them both a cup of tea and leaned on the counter. "That name mean anything to you?" Elijah nodded. "She was the last person I trusted before I walked away." "Then why does this feel like a blessing?" Rachel asked. He smiled softly. "Because for the first time, I think someone in my old world is telling me I made the right choice." Weeks passed. The garden behind the cafe bloomed slowly. Elijah and June planted sunflowers along the fence and named each one. Rachel hung wind chimes on the porch and found herself humming old tunes she hadn't remembered in years. The cafe held a rhythm now. Not just business, not just survival, but something like belonging. Then one evening, just before closing, a new customer walked in. She was young, maybe in her 20s, with nervous eyes and ink-stained fingers. She clutched a tattered notebook and asked softly if she could speak to the owner. Rachel stepped forward, but Elijah was already standing. The girl's eyes widened. "You're Elijah Cross." He paused. "Yes, I am." The girl swallowed hard. "I saw your speech at the Innovation Summit 6 years ago. You said if we wanted to change the world, we had to start with the people no one sees. I've never forgotten that. I dropped out of school and started a nonprofit that teaches coding to kids in shelters." Rachel looked at Elijah, stunned. The girl continued. "I was on a bus going nowhere this week and saw your face in the cafe window. I thought I was dreaming. But I came in anyway. I just wanted to say thank you." Elijah sat with her for an hour. He asked questions, listened to her story, took notes. When she left, he handed her a small envelope from his coat. Inside was a check, more than enough to fund her next year of work. Rachel stood in the doorway watching him. "You're still shaping things out there?" Elijah looked up at her. "Maybe. But the biggest thing I've ever built is right here." That night after June was asleep, he took Rachel by the hand and led her to the treehouse. The stars were out. The night was crisp and still. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. It was a list. "What's that?" she asked. "My plans for the rest of my life." Item 1. Build a home. Item 2. Fill it with people who make me better. Item 3. Wake up every day choosing them again. Rachel didn't speak. She just leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered, "That sounds like the best business strategy I've ever heard." Elijah smiled. "Then let's go make it happen." The mornings began earlier now, not because of obligation, but because of peace. Elijah found himself waking before dawn, not with urgency, but with purpose. He would brew the first pot of coffee and set 2 mugs on the counter before Rachel even came downstairs. June had taken to tiptoeing out of bed, just to sit beside him, while the Café still slept, her chin resting on the counter and her arms curled under her like a cat. She always asked the same question first thing. "What's today's adventure?" Elijah would look at her with a grin and reply, "Something small that might change everything." The Café had become something more than a business. It was a gathering ground for stories. Travelers left behind photographs and notes. Locals donated books. Musicians stopped in on Sundays to play for whoever was willing to sit and listen. Elijah had quietly turned the old back room into a reading nook for June, complete with a worn armchair, a lantern, and shelves filled with storybooks she couldn't yet read but insisted on memorizing. He started reading to her every night, never missing a chapter even when his old world tried to claw its way back in. And it did try. Some afternoons envelopes would arrive with embossed logos and firm language, requests for Elijah to serve as an advisor, a board member, a guest speaker at conferences where his name still held weight. He read them quietly and tucked them into a drawer. Not because he didn't care, but because he had finally learned to say no. The only legacy he cared to build now was carved in the laughter of a little girl and the warm hush of a busy café just after dusk. One morning as April gave way to May, Rachel pulled a folded paper out of the mail stack and handed it to him with a curious look. It was a formal notice from the city council. They were honoring the café with a community award for resilience, warmth, and service. There would be a ceremony, speeches, a presentation. The note mentioned Elijah by name, which meant someone had nominated them with a story that included him. Elijah blinked at the paper for a moment longer than necessary. Then he looked up at Rachel with a quiet smile. "I didn't think I was the type who won awards for kindness." She raised a brow. "Maybe that's why it matters so much that you do now." They decided to bring June to the ceremony, and she insisted on wearing the purple dress with yellow flowers and the too big cardigan that Elijah had accidentally shrunk in the dryer, but she still refused to give up. She drew pictures of herself holding the award and asked every 5 minutes if there would be cake. On the day of the event, Rachel curled June's hair while Elijah stood in front of the mirror awkwardly trying to remember how to tie a tie. It took 3 tries and Rachel's help before it looked close to right. The town hall was packed, not just with locals but with strangers who had passed through the café once and never forgotten it. The mayor gave a speech. A teacher read a letter written by one of her students about the blueberry muffins that made bad days better. Then Elijah was called to the stage. Rachel nudged him. "Go on. Say something true." He took the steps slowly. The microphone crackled. He looked out over the crowd and saw June grinning in the front row, her little fists clutching her sketchbook. Rachel sat beside her, eyes, calm, heart open. "I came here by accident," he began. "I was trying to get away from a life that had stopped feeling like mine. I thought I needed quiet. What I found was meaning. Not the kind built with contracts and skyscrapers. The kind built with laughter and shared mornings and people who tell you when you've burned the biscuits and love you anyway. This café saved me. These two girls in the front row saved me. And every person who came through those doors reminded me that success is not measured in millions. It is measured in mornings well spent. The applause was louder than he expected. June beamed like the sun. Rachel mouthed the words, "Thank you." And Elijah nodded as if to say, "I finally understand." That night they walked home slowly. June carried the certificate like it was made of gold. Rachel reached for Elijah's hand and held it all the way back. After they tucked June into bed, they sat on the porch wrapped in an old blanket, watching the stars blink on. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," Rachel said softly. Elijah turned his head. "Anything." She looked down for a moment, then back at him. "Are you ever going to ask if she's yours?" Elijah didn't flinch. He looked out at the garden. "I've wondered. The timeline fits. Her eyes, her stubbornness. But I've never needed proof. I don't want a test. I don't want a headline. I just want her to keep calling me her favorite person and mean it." Rachel nodded once. "That's what I hoped you'd say. Because she is yours, and you've never once made her feel like anything less." Elijah exhaled slowly, as if some quiet storm inside him had finally stilled. "Thank you for trusting me with her." Rachel looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for choosing us. Again and again. Always." They sat in silence until the stars faded and the porch light flickered off. In the following weeks, Elijah quietly adopted June, signing the papers with hands that did not shake. There was no press release, no photographer, just a simple ceremony in a courthouse where June wore her purple dress again and drew hearts on the corners of the forms. Elijah gave her a ring that had belonged to his mother and promised her that every bedtime would include at least one silly voice and one real hug. Life settled into a new normal. The cafe kept growing not in size but in depth. One regular donated a piano. Elijah started playing quietly on Thursdays, improvising lullabies for anyone who would listen. Rachel began offering cooking classes once a month, teaching the art of simple meals made with care. June took it upon herself to be head of decorations and turned each holiday into a full spectacle with handmade signs, streamers, and confetti trails that somehow always ended up in Elijah's pockets, but no life is without its shadows. One evening, a familiar car pulled into the gravel lot. Elijah saw it from the window and went still. It was sleek black and unmistakably expensive. From it stepped Malcolm Price, one of Elijah's oldest business rivals. Tall, sharp, ambitious, the kind of man who always knew more than he said. He entered the cafe with the air of someone who expected the world to wait for him. Elijah stood near the register, calm but watchful. Malcolm looked around, then gave a slow nod. "Still charming, I see." Elijah raised a brow. "What are you doing here?" Malcolm placed a file on the counter. "You left a vacuum. I'm filling it. I bought out your last competitor. I run the empire now. And yet you drove 3 hours to visit a place that doesn't sell anything in bulk." Malcolm smiled thinly. "I came to see if you were serious about giving it all up." Elijah stepped forward. "And did you find your answer?" Malcolm looked past him toward the back where June was wiping down chairs. He watched her for a moment, then looked back. "I did, and I envy you." That surprised Elijah more than anything else. Malcolm turned and left without another word. Rachel came out from the kitchen after he was gone. "Everything all right?" Elijah nodded. "Everything's better than all right. The past just came by to tip its hat to the future." She smiled at that and wrapped her arms around him. "Let's go close up. June wants to teach us both how to dance in socks tonight." That night in the kitchen, the three of them danced under the dim lights. No music, just humming, laughter, the soft patter of feet on tile. It wasn't a grand ballroom or a stage. It was better. It was theirs. And for Elijah Cross, once a man who had built cities with spreadsheets and ambition, nothing had ever felt more like home. The summer brought longer days and the kind of warmth that made the cafe feel like a sanctuary from the chaos of the world. June had taken to greeting every guest with a handmade menu and a joke she had memorized from an old book Elijah had given her. Rachel swore she saw customers return just to hear the latest one. On the slow afternoons, Elijah would take the radio out to the garden and sit with Rachel under the shade of the blooming apple tree they had planted together in the spring. It was no longer just a business. It had grown into a heartbeat that pulsed through the whole town. But life has a way of giving its final test just when you start to believe you have passed them all. One Monday morning, Elijah received a letter that came in a different kind of envelope. Heavy, white, stamped with a golden seal. Rachel watched his face as he read it, her hands still damp from washing strawberries. She had learned to read his silences. This one was not a silence of confusion or memory. This was the kind that signaled the closing of a chapter. He placed the letter on the table without speaking. Rachel picked it up. It was an invitation, the Global Innovation Forum, a panel named after Elijah himself. Apparently, in the years since he had disappeared from the business world, his ideas had continued to ripple. They were hosting a conference built on his legacy, and they wanted him to give the keynote speech. Elijah stirred his tea slowly. "I don't want to go back," Rachel asked softly. "Then why does it feel like you already left?" Elijah looked at her. "You think I should go?" She shook her head. "I think you have something to say, but only if you're saying it as the man you are now, not the one they remember." He sat with it for 2 days. He walked through the cafe and looked at every photo on the wall, every thank you card, every drawing June had tacked up with pride. Then he walked into June's room and asked her what she thought. She looked up from her notebook and asked, "Will there be cake?" Elijah laughed. "Probably not." She considered this. "That sounds boring. But if you go, can you tell them about us?" Elijah nodded. "That's the only reason I would go." So he went, not in a suit, but in a button-down that Rachel had ironed herself. Not with a limousine, but in the same old truck he had first arrived in. He arrived the night before the speech and stayed in the smallest room the hotel offered. He refused the penthouse suite. He refused the press interviews. When the day came, he stepped onto the stage in a room full of polished professionals and polished ambition. He carried with him a photo of the cafe taped to a note card and a small piece of chalk in his coat pocket. He stood at the podium and looked out. Then he stepped away from it entirely, walked to the side of the stage, found a blank wall and drew a small square with the chalk. "That square," he said, "is my cafe. It is where everything I thought I wanted came undone, and where everything I never knew I needed came to life." He talked for 20 minutes about failure, about running, about finding meaning in smallness. He told them about Rachel, about June, about blueberry muffins and bedtime stories, and the power of a place that sees people before they perform. The standing ovation was not what moved him. It was the quiet line afterward. People waiting not to take a photo, but to speak to him, to say thank you, to say I left too, to say I want to build something that matters. Elijah stayed an hour past the event's end. He gave out the cafe's phone number, told them to visit if they were ever near. On the flight back, he wrote a note in his journal. It read simply, "I did not go back. I went forward." When he returned, Rachel met him at the door. She didn't say a word, just kissed him on the cheek and handed him a dish towel. The sinks backed up again. "You up for it?" He grinned. "Always." The seasons turned again. June turned 7 and requested a treasure hunt instead of a birthday cake. Elijah built the clues himself and hid them all over the cafe and garden. Rachel baked a pie instead of cake, and June declared it the best treasure of all. Customers came and went. Some returned with children of their own. The cafe now had a little mailbox where guests could leave anonymous wishes. Every Sunday, Elijah read one aloud and Rachel would tape it to the wall. Some were simple. "I wish for a cat. I wish my mom would smile more." Others were heavier. "I wish I knew my father. I wish I could stay here forever." One day in late autumn, a man arrived with a guitar case and tired eyes. He said nothing at first, just ordered coffee and sat at the far table. June brought him a muffin on the house. He nodded, played a song quietly, a sad song. Elijah sat across from him when the cafe had emptied. The man finally said, "I used to play in stadiums. Now I play in silence." Elijah asked, "What changed?" The man answered, "I stopped being someone I liked." Elijah said, "Then start being someone new. We'll be your first audience." He stayed for 3 days, played a full set on Sunday evening to a crowd of 20. People cried. June danced barefoot. Rachel stood behind the counter and clapped the loudest. The man left with a smile on his face and a promise to return. Elijah watched him go and whispered to Rachel, "This is what healing sounds like." Years passed in the way only good years do. Quietly, steadily. One morning, June came downstairs with a box in her hands. "I need your help." Elijah sat up. "What's in the box?" She opened it slowly. It was a pile of drawings, notes, menus she had designed, photos. "I want to write a book about the cafe, about us. Will you help?" Elijah looked at Rachel, who was smiling behind her mug. "You write. I'll bake," Rachel added, "and I'll edit. But only if I'm allowed to add a recipe section." The book took a year. They printed it locally, sold it at the counter, gave away copies to anyone who said they were lost. One day, Elijah found a note tucked into one of the returned copies. It read, "I read this in a bus station in Nebraska. It made me turn around and go home." On the day the cafe turned 10, the mayor declared it Elijah Cross Day. June rolled her eyes and made fun of his hair in the commemorative photo. Rachel hung a garland of dried herbs over the door. Elijah made extra apple pie. At the end of the night, they sat together outside under the stars. June had fallen asleep in Rachel's lap. Elijah leaned back in his chair and said, "I thought legacy meant buildings." Rachel replied, "Legacy is who stands beside you when the chairs are empty and the lights are off." He closed his eyes, listened to the crickets, the laughter from a group walking down the street, the hum of the fridge inside. And he realized that everything he had run from had led him here, to a roadside cafe with uneven floors, to a woman who baked healing into bread, to a child who served dreams on napkins, to a home not marked by walls but by love so steady it no longer needed to announce itself. And that was enough, more than enough, always. And sometimes life doesn't give you what you planned. It gives you something better. A cracked mug filled with warmth, a child's laugh echoing through a quiet cafe. A second chance that doesn't arrive with fireworks, but with a knock on the back door and someone who chooses to stay. If this story touched you, tell us where you're watching from. We read every comment, and we'd love to know who's on the other side of the screen. For more stories that remind you what truly matters, Love Healing Family, stay right here. There's more waiting for you. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Share this with someone who believes in second chances. Because sometimes the greatest stories start with the smallest act of kindness.